Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to East West Wednesdays. My name is Snehal Desai, and I'm the producing artistic director, and we're so glad you could join us this week. Our conversation will be focused on our role as the Asian and Asian American community in advancing racial justice. And it will be a conversation led by Dr. Raja Gopal Bhattar and Dr. Joy Hoffman, who will actually be joining us. They will be joining us for a arc over the next 3 months, with sessions again on July 22nd and August 26th, where they will continue the conversation from today, as well as to talk about wellness and thriving in these times that we are living in. So we hope you will join us for that. After the Joy and Raja's conversation today, we'll close out with playing the finale Be from Rent, which was unveiled at our gala and involves performers from East West Players shows from the last 25 years. So if you have not caught that, it's a good way to close out your Wednesday. Our t-shirt campaign is going on, in case you didn't get so by the backdrop behind me. So it's an honor just to be Asian. T-shirts are again on sale to the end of this week. So make sure you get them if you haven't. Now is also the time to buy them for friends and family. It's Father's Day on Sunday. So make sure you get those orders in by the end of the week if you have not gotten your shirts yet. Make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell on our YouTube channel so that you are the first to know when we have posted new content, as well as make sure you like us on our Facebook page so that you get notifications when we have new programs coming. We are so glad you could join us again. Thank you. We hope you are safe and well. And until next time, I'm going to turn things over to Raja and Joy.
Thank you, Snehal. I'm so excited to be here along with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Joy Hoffman. My name is Raja Bhattar. I use they, them pronouns, and I am on currently occupied Potawatomi lands in Chicago.
Hi, I am Joy Hoffman. I use she, her pronouns, and I am resting currently on occupied Dakota land in Crookston, Minnesota.
Which I call Southern Canada.
Yes, we are very close to Canada.
And we're so excited to be here today to really be able to have this conversation. You know, I have been a supporter of EWP for almost a decade, probably over a decade, and just have always loved the way that we highlight and center Asian American perspectives and voices, particularly through theater and art. And as an artist, I think for me it has been both a home and a solace in a lot of spaces. And I've just really appreciated the way that EWP has organized amidst the COVID and quite a bit of the violence that's happening in our world to have these really important and difficult conversations. In my kind of daytime work, I am a full-time consultant doing diversity and equity work with higher education, nonprofit organizations, and working on strategic planning work. How about you, Joy?
Thanks, Raja. I used to also work in higher ed for about 25 years and have moved on to independent consulting as well, working with higher ed organizations primarily, but some nonprofits, especially I've been doing a lot of work with YWCA. And this is just really exciting for me because I love it when organizations outside of higher ed are also doing the social justice work. Because in my experience working in higher ed, it seemed always easy to have those conversations, and I wasn't sure what those conversations were like in other spaces. And so when Raja told me about East West Players, I just thought, this is so awesome that it's this organization that is doing art through theater and still having these critical conversations of how they can make an impact. Because I don't know that we're necessarily seeing that across the board. And so I'm really glad that you're having this conversation.
Yeah, agree. And so really to just give folks an idea of what's going to happen over a little bit of time, we're going to do some quick review of historical context about kind of Asian Americans and African Americans in the US. And then we're really going to think about kind of the current context that we're in and what's happening in the world. And then really engaging in some critical and difficult conversations that Joy and I love to have around how, as Asian Americans, we are both complicit within oppression and anti-Blackness, but also how we are part of the liberation struggle for all people, but especially for African Americans and Asian Americans, and how we build solidarity together. But before we get started, I think it's also important for us to kind of name a couple of things that we've been thinking about in terms of some, we are not experts. I think Joy and I together have over 40 years of higher education experience, and we've done a lot of work around Asian American identity and understanding social justice work and diversity and equity work within higher ed. But we're not historians, especially not experts on the Black experience. You know, we are Asian American and we're aware of that. But at the same time, we've been working on this. So we've been doing this work for quite a long time. And I feel like we hold these conversations even when we're not at work. And so for me, I think that feels like Joy and I literally talk about this probably every day. And really for the purpose of not just understanding what it's like for African Americans or Black folks in the country right now, but really understanding how we are under our own internalized prejudices and social and concerns that come up around identities of what it means to be Asian American within this larger dichotomy, larger framework of race in the U.S. And we also don't have all the answers. I think we're hoping that we want to ignite and guide your own reflection process for everyone that's listening. And also we will learn from each other, and we always do, and we'll learn from you all. And so really just, we want to be catalysts for this conversation. That's our hope. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that the history of our country is built on violence and mistreatment of many marginalized people, including Indigenous and African people, and quite a few others as well. So I think it's, and so know that even as Asian Americans, many of us, I think even as early as the 1800s, 1760s, we saw Filipinos here in the U.S. In the 1800s, we saw Chinese and Japanese folks building infrastructure for railroads in the gold rush and industrial era. We saw South Asian Americans and Desi Americans coming over in the early 1900s, and then definitely after the 1965 Immigration Act. But also we've seen a lot of backlash around Asian Americans as well. So we know there's been multiple Asian and Chinese exclusion acts. But also I think I've seen a lot of stories of how Asian Americans and other marginalized racial identities have been able to build coalitions for our collective liberation. So I think that's what gives me hope in this work. But I think, when we think about African Americans and Black folks in the US, it's a different history than many of us who even came over as indentured servants, because African Americans were enslaved and brought to the US starting in the 1600s. And so really literally ripped from their lands with no access or agency, and then built on the U.S. built the U.S. economy on stolen indigenous lands and the labor of enslaved African American people. And I think even when there's quite a few stories of Asian Americans who are also indentured servants, but African Americans were seen as a quote unquote cheaper alternative. So there's really interesting ways that we were already put into comparison with each other, and I think that has continued to be infecting who we are. And if we think about racism at the broader context, I think racism and anti-Blackness are very intertwined and kind of codependent, if you will. If we think about the eugenics movement to try to scientifically prove white people are superior to Black people or create kind of this pure race. If we think about the US Constitution, where African Americans were given less humanity, there were 3/4 of a person versus a white person. If we think about the violence, the rape, and other atrocities that have happened. So there's quite a bit of that history that we sit within. And today, I think we also see a lot of cultural appropriation of Black culture and celebration when it's aligned with kind of our own identities and pleasure, but not actually addressing the ways that we perpetuate violence and disenfranchisement of Black and African American people in the country.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, and Raj, I'm just so glad you've mentioned all of that, because I think as an Asian identified person who also identifies as a person of color, it would be easy for me to get into that mode of, well, I'm a person of color too, and as a person of color, I have been discriminated against, and I have felt oppression, and my people have felt oppression, and so what about us? And I was actually thinking about this morning. It's like, that actually sounds a lot like the All Lives Matter rhetoric, like almost, but coming from people of color. And I think it's one of the reasons we have a term of racism, and that there's also a very specific term, anti-Blackness, because racism against the communities of color, absolutely wrong, and we should always be talking about it, and we need to be talking about how we perpetuate it through, just through internalized racism, things like that. We need to recognize it in our own communities and in other communities. But I think when we start using it as a reason to dismiss very specific experiences that are often much more violent and much more oppressive, and in this moment of time especially, and quite honestly, this is not like, it's not like this current movement is new. It's just bigger this time. There's much more, I think there's much more engagement this time, even just compared to 5 years ago. We've seen it's one of the biggest civil rights protests, in the history. We've got 50 states and 18 countries, right? So something is happening, and it is specifically around anti-Blackness, and it is in support of Black Lives Matter. And so I think that's also one of the reasons this specific conversation is so important.
I agree. There's a difference to this movement, and I think that's partially why we're having this conversation, right? Like how, why is this different, and how are we as Asian Americans both complicit in the system, but also how do we, what's the agents that we have as being kind of in between kind of this larger racial framework of whiteness and Blackness. We have kind of threads in multiple spaces that we can push and pull, and so how do we do that in ways that are important? And particularly, I think, Joy, you named it, the movement is not unwarranted, right? I think we've seen violent and unnecessary murder of Black people, just to name a couple of the people that we have seen. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy, Fells, Robert Fuller,
George
Floyd, Malcolm Hart, just and many of them by police violence, or others that are still unknown as to what's happened, right? And so and that's only in the last 2 to 3 months,
right?
Let alone the centuries of violence that Black folks have experienced. And so again, what does it mean for us to sit in this space, and why is it important for Asian Americans to do this work, and not just as what does it mean for us, but really what does it mean for us to show up in this space?
Yes. And again, this is how we want to center this conversation, because we're not coming to you, with all this knowledge of Black people and Black communities, and here, let us tell you about this. We really are entering into this space as two Asian identified individuals to talk about, a little bit of our journey of what it means to address our own anti-Blackness, and think about what we can be doing to support Black communities, but through that lens of what are we as Asian identified folks doing within the movement, and also being very clear that we're not speaking for Black people. Right. What we are attempting to do is speak with Black folks in the ways in which they have communicated they need our support, and this is through conversations with friends and colleagues and family, and reading just staying up on our own reading and educating ourselves, and really listening to understand what is needed from us, not what we can do for someone else. And I think that's a difference that we have to also name. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Joy, and really thinking about who are we centering, like you said, and what's the purpose. I think I've heard a lot of friends say, I think there's a quote that there's various forms of allyship, right? But often people go to, well, and I should do this because if something happens to me, then I want Black people to support me. And that's still it's still self-centering, right? It's well, I want to do it just so then I have favor when something happens to me, but rather than, no, this is a systemic issue that we are all complicit within this larger system of racism. And so though as Asian American, as a marginalized identity, we may not be racist, we have racial prejudices and racial tendencies that also influence the way we show up in these spaces. And particularly right now, I think for us, for me at least, I think as an immigrant, anti-Blackness is something that I've always thought of as an American thing, but as I think deeper, it's not. There's actually something deeper. I remember, as a kid in India being told, well, you shouldn't go outside, you're gonna get too dark and you're not gonna be admirable, or, you should use a facial cream so you can get lighter skinned, or You should straighten your hair, or, when I had hair, just all these different messages that was still centering whiteness, which was interesting because I think
Right.
earlier in my development, I thought about, well, if I'm from a majority people of color country, then I can't I can't center whiteness because, I was surrounded by Indian people. And yet I think then we ignore the history of colonization, colonialism, and the impact of whiteness being so embedded into our culture that we don't even realize that it's a different culture, that we think it's an internal experience. That's not to excuse that we have had our own systems around caste and other systems of oppression that are also at play. So there's intersectionality and collusion of oppression that's happening. And at the same time, also to recognize that our standards of beauty, our standards of professionalism, our linguistic privilege, and access to, and the fact that English is one of our primary languages in India. And so there's all these ways that we are also colluded to Western and US and white centricness that influences the way we show up. And so for me, I think I Joy, you and I had a conversation a couple of days ago that really made me reflect on, oh yeah, this is not just an American issue. This is a global concern, because we as a world, through colonization and just all the stuff that's happened since the 1600s, have kind of come to a place where whiteness is valued at higher levels across the board. And so our job is to undo that larger system.
Well, we see this at an international level, like even when we travel. Like when I've gone to other countries, there's always business owners and shops, and there's always someone who speaks English. It's like other countries have centered what they see as valuable in terms of what is going to speak to more people, what is going to make other people more comfortable. And yet in the US, you go into any business and it's, unless the business owner specifically has made it if it's a value of theirs, or it's something that's important to them, if you speak a different language and you cannot speak English, you're not going to be able to communicate with the store owner or their employees, because that's not necessarily a priority. And so it's like you said, it's not just US centering whiteness, the English language, and all of these things that really just promote this privilege of being white, but it's other countries do it as well, and it's insidious. For me specifically, my story, Raja, is like, yes, I am Asian identified, but I also was adopted by white parents. So my journey of understanding even just myself as a person of color, much less understanding racism, understanding how I am complicit, not just as an Asian identified person, as a person of color, but someone who grew up in white culture. So you talk about, being in India, and yes, there's majority people of color there, and the culture is very, is relevant to the region that you're in, and it's not US culture, and yet it's still white centered in many ways, whether it's talking about skin color and colorism and the way in which we think and do things, and who are we trying to make comfortable, all those things. Well, when you're also being raised in a white family, it's just even more prominent. And so I talk about this in a research article I once wrote about how, adoptees who are raised by white parents are often raised to be white. And so I have that extra layer of, I didn't grow up in an Asian family either. And so there's it's just this complexity of, even if I would have grown up in an Asian family, I would still be combating anti-Blackness and perpetuating whiteness. But then growing up in a white family and having all white schools and neighborhoods and education and religious organizations, all of those things, it literally raised me to be white. And so my own journey has been complex in and of itself. So these conversations are hard. And, and I think if we can come to this space and understanding this is a hard conversation to have, we hope that our listeners will also understand that it's okay to have feelings about what we're talking about, and to have some unrest and some discomfort, because that's also how we grow. But so we want people to kind of sit with whatever feelings they're having right now as we are talking about our own journey, and maybe something is resonating with you. Maybe you disagree with us, or maybe something really just like, wow, that's exactly how I'm feeling as well. But whatever feelings you're having, you might be really angry in the moment in terms of what's going on in the world. You may feel neutral. You might be sad. You might be confused. You might be like, this is so complex. I'm a person of color, and yet, wait, I can be anti-Black. How does that work? Like all of those feelings are valid.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I think that's probably a good segue to think about kind of how are we as Asian Americans complicit within this larger anti-Blackness system, and how is anti-Blackness showing up in our spaces? Maybe I'll have you go with that first, and then I'll follow up.
So I think I think it comes in many forms. And I first want to just say that if you feel that anti-Blackness is just using the N-word or wearing a white robe, then really stay on this. Keep watching this video, because I think we're going to challenge that. We're going to challenge that quite a bit, because the ways in which I have been anti-Black in my experience have not been like that. It's been more of these subtle behaviors that are still very harmful. And in many ways, I think sometimes, like I always talk about how if I'm walking down the street and someone calls me a racial slur, yes, that's violent and it's hurtful, but I know where that person stands in my relationship with them. Like, I know I'm going to stay away from you. You are a violent, harmful person. But when someone I care about, who cares about me, maybe it's a friend or a family member, does something, sometimes it hurts even more, because it feels a little more like betrayal. Like the neighbor across the street didn't betray me because I didn't know them. But when I'm in relationship with someone and they do something, it feels a little bit like betrayal, and it's harder because then I have to sit with the feeling, do I confront this person? Like, do I confront this person and potentially break a relationship? Do I confront this person and hurt their feelings, or do I not confront this person and now I'm being complicit, and all these different things. And so I think when I think about the times that I have potentially been in my behavior something, a form of anti-Blackness, I think about if my friend has never said anything to me, why is my friend not saying something to me? Like, if my friend's not willing to say, hey, Joy, I know that wasn't your intent, but this comment that you made was like really problematic, and here's why. And then I'm having to unpack, wow, what have I done in this relationship to the point where my friend does not feel like they can confront me on this. So that's a whole nother layer of, okay, I've harmed this person, and this person doesn't even feel comfortable telling me. And it's layered with, that person shouldn't have the obligation to say anything, right? Like, that person, it's not that person's job to educate me either. And so there's that layer. And so
Right.
what am I constantly doing to unlearn my own anti-Blackness? And we were going to be sharing an article with you that lists the very subtle ways anti-Blackness shows up. And I was thinking about, as I was reading when I first read the article, I remember I went into the space thinking, oh gosh, I hope I don't do these things. Like, I hadn't even read anything yet. I'm thinking, I hope I don't do these things. And I realized that's not how I should be going into the space. How I should be going to the space is, I'm sure I've done some of these things. And so, Joy, get ready to read this list and digest, yes, I've done that. Yes, I've done that. And take it as an opportunity for learning, but also growth and change. And so, but one of the things I was reading was, one of the examples was that a form of anti-Blackness is when you suddenly develop a black scent, and so like talking like you're black, and I use that in quotes, but I thought, oh, I don't do that, and then I started thinking, there's times where I'll be talking to a black woman friend and I'll just suddenly say girl, or I'll be texting and I will spell girl Gurrrl, and I'm thinking, this is not how I normally talk, and so why am I specifically talking to my black woman friend like this? And so, and I didn't even realize I was doing it until I read that article, and that really made me reflect on, I've done that, oh my gosh, joy. But now, and this is just like 5 days ago. So now I'm thinking, I really need to change that behavior. But it's things like that. We are always learning. Like Raja and I talked earlier about how we came onto the space. We have years of experience of social justice education and working specifically in spaces to change organizational cultures through our consulting, through our professional work, and yet we are still always learning in on a daily basis. And so we want to be, we want to share that with you too, is that we're not coming into this space thinking that we know everything, because I'm still constantly learning. Like I just said, like I read this article 5 days ago, and it really made me think about my own behaviors.
Yeah. I think for me, I've been thinking about kind of how am I complicit in these different systems as well. And I think I had to go, I'm a history nerd, so I went back a little into history. And one of the first cases of South Asian Americans fighting for citizenship is from like I believe the 1800s. Don't quote me on that. I think it's 1800s. But Bhagat Singh Thind, who was a Sikh American person who had come as a indentured worker to the West Coast and actually fought the Supreme Court to be identified as white for citizen, because at that point only white people could be citizens. And so this need to be white and this need to kind of be like the quote unquote the top tier, if you will, in the social hierarchy, I think has been so embedded into, for me at least, in our own racialization, racial culture from as long as back as I can remember. I remember for me, it's been interesting with my family because I see so much, so many messages that I got as a child around anti-Blackness that wasn't malevolent, but it was based on no actual data, but except for the stuff that they saw in the media and things that they had learned, especially having been in India, and only things that in India, when you say you're American, people are like, but you don't look white. And so, American equals white. And so there's even that level. But then once you come to the US, there's still this understanding. I remember when I was a kid, my parents would say, one of my, I would hang out with a couple of different friends. I had a pretty diverse group of friends, and they'd say, they would name all my other friends by name, but then they'd call the one Black friend that I have in that specific social group, oh, I'm the Black kid, right? And I was like, why does that person not deserve a name? And so we just would go, and I was like, their name, you can say, it's not that hard. And yet that was like, and it was not malevolent, but it was just the way they had framed it, or also the messages of, well, don't hang out with Black people, they're dangerous, right? And these, what was, I think, in my family's eye, safety and trying to protect me, without knowing that that's a hugely anti-Black statement.
Absolutely.
And part of my own work has been undoing that, right? And how is that? And thankfully, I've been lucky enough to be in spaces to engage and excavate some of that work in my own self. And then thinking about kind of how this influences how I show up in different spaces. What does it mean for me to advocate for, support, and engage with other people, and not allow that system? And I think about, in my own professional bit, I'm sure I've had, I've said something or done something that may have been inappropriate, not because I'm a bad person. I think that's part of what I'd like to make sure people is like, being anti-Black does not mean you're a bad person. It means that we have undoing to do, right? And we as a community, because Asian Americans, have a huge responsibility to engage in that, which becomes even more difficult, particularly within Southern California, just given the ways that white systems, particularly police, framed and have developed interracial bias and I would say, animosity, particularly around like the LA riots of '92 and Korean Americans and African Americans, and we continue to see there's lots of documentation of these white dominant systems of power and pitting people against each other as a way to kind of create this social hierarchy of fighting for each other, so that we have to feel like we have to fight each other to get ahead, quote unquote, wherever that is. Which allows us to then actually not address the larger systemic issues. And so I think for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about what are these larger systems that are happening, and why is it important for me to engage in talking about police violence and anti-Blackness, because at some point we are also colluded into believing that all police are supporting, are helpful for us. I think that's at least for me, I feel like my parents always said, well, just call the police if there's any problem, wherever you are. And I'm not sure if a Black person would ever say that to their child in this world. And for me also, then I have to think about, if I'm willing to, if I'm to call the police, what would happen to these other people that are around me? And how does that impact folks that are there? And particularly in this moment around George Floyd, I think the fact that one of the police officers is Hmong American is also difficult for me. I think that's, for me, has been hard to sit with, like, what does it mean as a very visual example of how Asian Americans are complicit in this larger system, to stand by and see this white officer harm this unarmed person, leading to their death, and how, and I know it's also not fair to put all the burden of anti-Black Asianness on one person, but I think it was just a really important symbol for, oh yeah, we are building into the system, and how do we undo this system, and what do we think about the ways we have fought against not wanting to be seen as Black, right? I even think about affirmative action and some of the cases that have been brought up by Asian Americans against affirmative action cases, because it seems like, well, we're the good ones. Why are we not allowed access? And yet knowing that that's also, again, this led, and there's again documentation that the movement for undoing affirmative action has been led by white conservatives using Asian Americans to disenfranchise particularly Black and brown people who have not had access to education systemically, historically, et cetera. And yet we're still part of that work. And so what does it mean for us to sit in that space? And how do we actually push back and challenge that space?
Like, yeah, well, I mean, and some of the things you are getting at is that whole model minority narrative, which is absolutely used to pit Asian Americans against Black Americans, or just
Right.
or Asians against Black folks.
Right.
And I think, and yes, it does hard, we talk, there's much more, this is a whole nother topic. There's much more nuanced conversations around the model minority and how it also hurts Asian Americans in terms of leadership and all those different opportunities. But the other side of it too is it pits it, especially when we internalize it, that somehow, I'm not this, or yes, this is, I am harder working, or I'm XYZ, all these lists of things. And how is that perpetuating, again, whiteness and what is valued with whiteness? And how is it perpetuating this divide? And when really it was, that whole concept was really created to promote this divide, because if we can get this group of people of color to be against this group of people of color, we divide and conquer, and we just sit back and watch. We sit back and watch them fight. And even right now in COVID, yes, Asians are being discriminated against. So we are absolutely in this conversation not dismissing that. And we're not trying to say, oh, well, that doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. There have been some horrific things that have happened to Asian folks, especially amidst COVID. And we've seen it. We've seen how just the hate for Asians has shown itself. And so when we talk about, well, we're people of color too, and we experience racism. Yes. But that conversation has been used to somehow dilute the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that's what we're trying to, promoting Black Lives Matter and being behind Black Lives Matter and centering Black lives does not mean that we're dismissing the experiences of Asian folks in this country. It's just that right now, Black folks are being hunted and targeted and killed. And so that's more than just prejudice and racism and really horrible experiences. That's like people are dying. And so that's why we need to have this conversation. One of the things that you were talking about, Raja, really started making, because you were talking about how you were raised in India, and I think I kind of talked about how I was, I talked about how I was raised. So one of the ways in which I think anti-Blackness really showed up in my family was just raising me to be colorblind. So I talked about being raised to be white. Well, that meant that in my family, that was not just raised to be colorblind, but in my faith community, raised to be colorblind. And my faith community continues to be colorblind. Like I have not seen, so I identify as Christian, very loosely. So I think I'm more my faith journey and my relationship with something greater than me is very personal to me now, where before I think it was much more at an organizational level, because that's how I was raised. Like you go to church every Sunday and these are the things you do, right? And some of the things you do is you don't talk about race. And so I still remember coming home one day saying this neighborhood kid called me this name, and it was some racial slur. And, being told, it's okay, you're one of us, white, one of us, and Jesus loves you. Like somehow that was supposed to just take everything away, right? And this is the rhetoric that we have, like, well, just love everybody. Well, when loving is not recognizing that this particular individual is feeling pain, that's not love. And so, and colorblindness, it's well-intended. I don't think it's malicious, but it absolutely dismisses, when you don't see color, it absolutely dismisses the person's experiences and their pain, because they absolutely have experiences and pain that go with the color of their skin. And so I think early on, just me being raised to be colorblind, and then things like in college, being told I'm not one of them, the other Asian students. So being rewarded for acting white, being rewarded for not getting too dark. Like I tan very quickly, and so I would tan throughout the summer and just get darker and darker and darker. My daughter's the exact same way. She can walk outside for 5 minutes and she's a whole nother shade of brown. And I would get told, you're getting too dark. My daughter, when she was 3 years old, tried scrubbing her brown skin off in the bathtub because she said she wanted her white skin back. Okay, we had never, I was like, where are you getting this from? And I remember sitting with her saying, you've never had white skin. And so then this is the media. I mean, and so then like all of a sudden we're like taking Disney movies off the shelf. We're like, we're not watching these anymore. Because she specifically said, well, if I don't get my white skin back, I can't be a princess. Age three, she was already learning that dark skin is bad. And so, so like this is insidious. So then it even just taught me that even when I'm making every effort as a parent to combat these things, the rest of the world is still feeding these messages. So I think that is just how insidious it is. And I think if we can accept the fact that even when we're doing our own internal work, and even when we are doing everything we can to combat our own internalized, whether it's internalized hate or racism or anti-Blackness, that the world is still talking to us. And that is why we constantly have to keep learning and growing and being, consistent in combating it. Because if we suddenly think okay, I've learned everything I need to learn and I'm good, that's extremely dangerous. That's
Yeah.
extremely dangerous.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. And that example of your daughter is just so heart-wrenching and yet so real, right? So many of us have experienced that and kind of internalized those messages at 3. And so, thinking about the fact that how can I be complicit? Because it's so embedded into our culture, it's like water. It's like a fish doesn't know that it's in water because it's in water. It just, that's all it's known. And so for us, how do we think about the fact that we as a marginalized identity population in racial identity as Asian Americans are marginalized in these different systems of power and oppression. And we also have the ability to do that, also be part of the complicity of anti-Blackness and Black-centric racism, because we're part of this larger system where we have this longer history that we bring, and so we can do both. And so and we have that also then gives us the agency to have access to voices where other folks, particularly Black folks, might not have access to spaces, and also gives us a responsibility to name things and have conversations in ways that we can continue to, we're going to continue to mess up, but we got to continue to do better. So I wanted to just maybe transition us, because we have a couple minutes left, to think about what are some resources and things that would be helpful and strategies to start our own journey of naming and excavating anti-Blackness.
So I think so we will be providing some articles for you to read, and I think through some links. And I think there one of the things that we are actually providing is a article that is on colorblindness. I think no matter where you are in your journey, if you still feel like colorblindness is the way to go, I really want to challenge you to read this article. Again, I don't believe that anybody who is colorblind is doing it with malicious intent. I think the intent is, it's always around, well, I just want to see you as a human being. And so the intent is, I think the intent is actually loving, but it's actually really harmful, because like I said before, is if you're not willing to see someone's skin color, you're not willing to then acknowledge or accept the fact that they might have very different experiences in this world, which means then you don't see their pain. And you also don't see their beauty. Like we don't want to erase people. And so I think when you can see someone's color, there's a difference between seeing skin color and being prejudiced and discriminating against someone, right? So I always talk about how children see color. People talk about, oh, children are colorblind. No, they're not. if you hand a small child, age 2 or 3, a box of crayons, they're going to tell you, if they've learned their colors, they're going to tell you what the colors are. They're not going to say, I don't see color. They're going to say they see color. So color is beautiful. Children see color. They learn prejudice. They learn how to discriminate. They learn anti-Blackness. They learn racism. And so color, it's okay to see color. And I think we need to get to this place where we understand that seeing color is in and of itself not discriminatory. It's not, it's when you act upon that, and you act upon your biases, which, by the way, we all have biases. When you act on that, that's when it becomes really problematic. And so just understanding that we do have biases, and that we have to combat those on a regular day. We do have visceral reactions to certain things, and we have to recognize when that happens. I think that there's an article also, I was talking earlier about the examples of anti-Blackness in very subtle forms, because it's so easy to say that, well, I don't do this, and so therefore I'm not anti-Black. And I'm hoping that article challenges folks to really think about what are the subtle ways in which I might be showing my anti-Blackness, very much like some of the examples we were giving earlier about, something as simple as, oh, I'm getting too dark. If I'm getting, if I'm out in the sun, been at the lake for the summer or whatever, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting too dark. What does that mean? What does it mean to be too dark? Where did we learn that? There's also there was a really great article on how people of color need to be thinking about anti-Blackness. And I think, again, this goes back to our conversation around, it's so easy to sit with this identity of being a person of color and say, okay, so we're all people of color, and we're in this camp, and then there's the white people. If you are really paying attention, there have been a lot of articles and there have been a lot of things going out recently that start with white folks and non-Black people of color or non-Black POC. And a lot of those pieces, whether they're articles, videos, or educational tools, are coming from Black folks. So Black folks are specifically naming white folks and non-Black people of color. There's a reason for that. It's because Black folks have been oppressed, whether it's racism and anti-Blackness or horizontal oppression. They have been oppressed by both white folks and non-Black people of color. So I think we need to pay attention to that. And so, hopefully some of these pieces will be helpful in some of your reading and consideration, but it doesn't stop there. This is just a short list of things to start with, to consider, to digest. But we absolutely encourage you to continue learning. There are some reading lists. There's actually a Black Lives Matter, a BLM reading list of resources. So tons of resources for you. I think what's important to also say is that reading only does so much. Like, I can read all day, I can watch documentaries, I can watch films, I can go to a protest, I can do these things, I can write my legislators, that's great. And action is going to look to you very different, like it may look to someone else. But what does it look like to have that really hard conversation with a friend or with a family member, and to take that risk, right? It's real easy to go to a protest where everybody around you is there for the same reason and post that on Instagram. But what does it look like to tell a family member, I'm sorry, like, we may have to change our relationship because this is just something I'm not going to just agree to disagree on.
Mm-hmm,
like this is not I like cats, you like dogs, I like tea, you like coffee. Like, you literally are saying things that are dehumanizing and that completely dismiss the pain in this world. And so what does that relationship look like, and how does that change? How are we taking risks at work, at our organizations? How are we doing more than just, well, I'm reading? How are we actually taking risks? Because Black folks are taking risks all the time. And I think when I've been reading and when I've been listening to what Black folks are saying they want from me as a non-Black person of color, it's more than just reading and watching documentaries. They want me to speak up, and they want me to take risk. And so really sit with that, really want to challenge you to sit with that. And risk may look different for everybody, but are you willing to take those risks?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Joy. So that's kind of our episode and some conversation. I think for us, it was just important to kind of name how we engage in this work, how we're complicit in this work, how we're continuing to undo some of our own internalizations around anti-Blackness, given the important moment that we're in as a world, as a community, but also that it's been happening for four centuries. So it's time for us to also name how we can undo this system. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to EWP for this opportunity. We hope this is helpful. Check out the links, and all our social media is on there as well. So give us some feedback.
There is no future, there is no past. Thank God this moment's not the last. There's only us, there's only this. Forget, regret, or life is yours to miss. No